Clint, you're up.
Thanks. So I'm going to start off with a question for the crowd. Who here thinks that the death of bin Laden was important for the rise of ISIS? Raise your hand. Do you think that bin Laden was important, that killing bin Laden was important? Did he make a difference? Was he significant enough? Some say no, some say yes. The answer, I did a survey on the day that he was killed. The answer resoundingly was, it doesn't matter. Bin Laden doesn't matter. He's not important. I would tell you that Zawahiri, being a very ineffective and disliked manager, is the reason that ISIS was more than willing to break away. If I did this conference 10 years ago, everyone would tell me that oaths of allegiance bind forever. They will never be broken. I heard this. This was in D.C. Once they pledged the ideology of al-Qaeda, they will never break away, because that oath, it means so much to them. They're all in this together for the ideology. Over the last 3 years, there have been more bias broken. People have switched allegiances. You have a fracture right now in Boko Haram. You have a fracture group in Jabhat al-Nusra right now. You have fractures in ISIS. I could probably come up with 24 of them. Why didn't we call this Mujahideen 3.0? Why do we call it Al-Qaeda? Or why do we call it ISIS? When I first came into this sort of era of terrorism, it was in the 1990s, and I didn't even know it at the time that it was called Al-Qaeda. We were talking about the 1998 embassy bombings, and the military was talking about different actions, the U.S. military at the time. We called them the Mujahideen. That's what we called them. So as analyst and terrorist analyst, if I rewound 3 years ago and I said, we're going to have a conference and we're going to talk about 2 competing terrorist groups, people would have said, no way, that's not going to happen. Al-Qaeda runs the show. 2 years and 3 months ago, I was on a panel that was called, What is Al-Qaeda's Grand Strategy? And I had to argue for 90 minutes with another analyst who told me that ISIS was nothing. It was a flash in the pan. It was totally going to go away. And 6 days later, they took Mosul. So I would tell you right now, more than anything, is we are terrible at anticipating what the future is going to look like unless it looks like something we've seen in the past. So we're talking about Al-Qaeda versus ISIS right now, and I would tell you that there's already a third thing that has emerged. And we're calling it Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and that was an excellent point Yassine just made. They don't even know if they're Al-Qaeda or ISIS. We spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. talking to Al-Qaeda and ISIS because if we can't make sense of all of it, then what do you need us for? Right? We're not very important if we can't tell you how all of this is organized. It has never been so disorganized. Speed is amazing. In 2 years, ISIS has risen and fallen. If I asked anybody in this room, could you tell me the top 10 members of ISIS right now? If you can, I would like to know, because I don't know who they are. Who are the top 10 people in Al-Qaeda right now? In the 1990s, most of the people that we considered in the U.S. on 9/11 to be Al-Qaeda members didn't even know they were in Al-Qaeda. They thought they were just terrorists leading their own groups. If you go back through some of the interviews, some of the people that were wrapped up, we said, he is the number 5 man in Al-Qaeda. And number 5 man would go, I'm in Al-Qaeda? Totally confused. So we spend a lot of time trying to organize chaos and try and make sense of all of it. But what I would tell you is there's a general theme that occurs. Foreign fighter migrations lead to other conflicts later on. Let's think about it. The Mujahideen, the foreign fighters that went to Afghanistan, they ultimately did what? There were tons of foreign fighters left over. They spawned Al-Qaeda. Generation 1. I call it the Bruce Springsteen generation of Al-Qaeda. Kind of old, boring now, but we still listen to it from time to time. Second generation, the Islamic State. Who was that? Those were the foreign fighters that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan 10 years ago. What did it spawn? The Islamic State. Right now, we have the largest and most diverse foreign fighter migration in the history of the world. Why do we think it will only look like Al-Qaeda or ISIS? I would tell you we're in the era of Jamaats and Ansars, and there are dozens of them. And in some places, they'll be called Al-Qaeda, or they'll switch their name, like Nusra did. Why would Nusra If this was all part of Al-Qaeda's master plan, which everyone tells me was a secret, yet we all know about it in this room somehow. I don't know how we all know about it. If this was part of their master plan, why would they change their name? Why would Jolani feel like he needs to break away from his old Islamic State partners and fight them at one point, and then also have to arrange some sort of passive way to disconnect from Al-Qaeda at another point? We're already entering into a third generation. It's less global. Any extremist group that's out there right now is dumb if they want to go on a globalist agenda. They've watched Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State be crushed by global counterterrorism efforts. Why? Why pursue that agenda anymore? When people say Al-Qaeda to me, that's the globalist agenda. So I see a lot of things labeled as Al-Qaeda right now that I don't think are Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but the blend of both. State building. Avoid big global conflicts. We'll build up our own steam here. And that's because, one, they're rational first and ideological second. They always pursue their own politics. They always try and carve out their own space. And they do what they need to do to survive. And they will change that ideology. They'll morph it rapidly. Think how quickly the ideology of Al-Qaeda has changed just in the last 20 years. Just in the last 5 years, the things the Islamic State has added to. What about sectarianism? So the other thing that I think we got to look at more than anything moving forward is there are dozens of terrorist groups that are out there around the world right now, and they've followed two models up to date that won't work in the future. Al-Qaeda's model was donor-based. Why was bin Laden the most important terrorist? Because he had money and the others did not. He could resource his operations, he could get them moving. The Islamic State, why did it grow so quickly? Because they built a state and they actually taxed their people. They governed and they had the largest resource base, as Paul said. So moving forward, neither of those are going to work. So what are they going to do? They either have to pursue their own efforts to start to pull finances, like Abel Mukhtar, who does black market operations, or maybe they go towards state sponsors, because this is the most sectarian conflict there's ever been. Some places, Al-Qaeda groups will do better. Some places, Islamic State groups will do better. And in other places, we'll have something that's completely different, where we'll have warlords that essentially govern under jihadist states. And why will that be? Because dictators fell and democracies failed, and the world has watched. So moving forward, I would say Al-Qaeda versus ISIS. I would try to imagine what we've never seen before, which is probably neither Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State.
One of them is looking to the future and trying to predict what might happen in the coming years as this divide and the division between Al-Qaeda and IS continues to take form, and what exactly will be born out of what's happening. I think, Clint, maybe we'll just start with you because you touched upon that. So what's next? What you've spoken and written about, possibly the establishment or the formation of a third entity that could come out of the division and the split between Al-Qaeda and IS. What would that look like beyond? Would it be reunification? Would it be something else? If you had to predict,
I don't even think it'll be an entity. I think it will be a third paradigm, basically, which will be a series of groups that have two or three things that they do. One, they have their own financing that they can bring by either building some sort of emirate, a small state, which they can operate, or they have a mega donor of some sort, which we've seen this kind of crop up in Libya. There's lots of little groups, militias running around that have pulled in their own donor base. Or three, you have state sponsors, particularly around the sectarian issue, which come in on the Sunni or Shia side, which they see these extremist groups as particularly useful. And if you look back to the 1990s, that was very common, especially here with the Palestinian groups. The other thing is there's no reason to focus on big global attacks unless you have a couple things happening to you. One, you need to reinvigorate your brand. Let's say your group is on the brink of desolation. One thing you can do is elevate your game by doing a big global attack or a regional attack, which brings attention to yourself. So that sometimes can be a reason why you start to pursue that global agenda. Beyond that, I think bin Laden would tell you, if you look at the bin Laden documents from Abbottabad, the last thing you want is a series of drones hovering over your head. It is look at the Islamic State's rise all the way up to when coalition airstrikes started, and then how quickly it's come back down again. Same thing with Nusra right now. Part of the reason Nusra has tried this rebranding effort is to sidestep the armed use of military force in the U.S., which is, I'm not part of Al-Qaeda, so you shouldn't be able to target me anymore, right? That's a little bit what they're trying to do. So they're trying to push off that global agenda. The other part is about winning local support. And there's a couple of competing approaches, and a lot of us were talking about it last night and this morning, which is Al-Qaeda has always tried to win over local support and done it very slowly. And they're always trying to be sneaky. They're so sneaky and smart. But somehow when they're sneaky and smart, they still lose their way with the local populace, or they have to compromise their own ideology to win over that local support. The Islamic State's gone the reverse route, which is we don't really care what the local populace thinks. We'll just beat them into submission through violence, and then they'll just do what we want. And so over time, I think there's becoming this nexus between the global agenda and winning local support. That's really what Nusra has had to decide. And then the method by which you advance your ideology. And I think that's what we'll see moving forward is it'll be more local. There'll be lots of regional and local dynamics. There'll be connections to both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I don't know as a 20 to 24-year-old between North Africa and Southeast Asia, how you don't have a connection to the Islamic State at this point. There's tens of thousands of foreign fighters out there. We used to make a big fuss of this in Washington after 2002. We'd say, he's connected to Al-Qaeda. Well, good grief. Every 20-year-old man in North Africa and the Middle East is connected to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. So I think we're going to see a much more local phenomenon where people try and carve out their space, build up their resources, and what we see in the future will look more like the 1990s, which is a very distributed terrorism landscape over the horizon.